Hi folks, my name's Jean Williams and this is a brief talk about the history of the England women's football team, the women's national team. So as with all of the things that I do, you don't want to sit and listen to me for an hour or even probably for 45 minutes. So I'm going to give a quick outline of the history and how it came together. And then I'd prefer it if we have an interactive session. Feel free to ask me about any area of the research for the book. So how I came to be doing what I'm doing is that I was originally a teacher of English in a sixth form college, and I played football. But I didn't just play football, I was the chair of the East Midlands League. I was doing my coaching badges, I was helping to run a club, I was running a coach mentoring scheme. At one stage, my husband didn't really see me that much due to football. So I moved literally next door for work from the sixth form college to the university to train teachers in English. And the university said to me, well, if you're going to work here, you're going to have to do a PhD in something. Would you like to do it in assessment of students? And I'm like, no, you're all right, thanks. That sounds actually quite dull. So because I played football, I'm like, has anybody written a history of women's football before? And that's back in 97, 98. And nobody had done that before, so I did a PhD in it. It was extremely difficult. But because I was so networked, the research was actually going to the houses of older women and their relatives and just sitting in their front rooms. It was the days before mobile phones had cameras. So I had a laptop, which was quite a new thing in 1998. My laptop then was like a brick, and a physical scanner, and I'd go to people's homes and I'd scan in the documentation, and that's how I collected the material. So I got the PhD and then had the good fortune to FIFA in 1999 for Women's World Cup in Los Angeles were looking for an expert on women's football, and there weren't many of them in the world. So I had the good fortune to go out to Los Angeles to Women's World Cup, and I got funded to do research ever since. So I've written a number of academic histories of women's football. And then back in 2018, just before, a couple of years before the pandemic hit, the FA came to me and said, how many women do you think have played for England? And although I've been doing this at that point for quite a long time, I'm like, I don't know, maybe about 500. And they said, well, we actually want to look at that work and see. And you'll see in a number of sports, they're doing it in rugby and a number of other team sports. The men have had it for years, which is each player who plays for the national team gets a unique number in order of which they played for the national team. And that was the work that the FA wanted to do. And so this kind of became my lockdown project. But it was very, very difficult because there was no set archive to go to do this kind of research. But by then I built up a network of about 20 years of people who I knew collected programmes and memorabilia and those kind of things, and I knew quite a few of the England players themselves, so I was able to do interviews about their careers. And that's the gist of the book. There were actually, by the time England won the Euros in 2022, there were actually 227 women who had played for England. So I was quite wrong in my initial assessment of thinking it would be 500. And the first England team was formed in 1972. So we looked at all of the games that were then considered official, and then we looked at when each player made her debut. And of course that was made more difficult, particularly for the 72 players, because of their age. So I'll talk about a little bit about that. The 1972 first official team were formed not by the FA, because the FA had not taken control of women's football yet. They didn't actually take full control of women's football until 1993. It was organised by a body called the Women's FA, which had formed back in 1968. There's a guy called Arthur Hobbs, and he, along with Pat Gregory and a number of other important women, Flo Bilton, some of these characters are in the book. They were all organising women's football separately in little clubs all over the country, but they weren't yet unified as a body. And for those of you who were not at the gallery talk earlier on, the reason that those people didn't know one another is that women's football was banned in this country by the FA from 1921 until 1970, January 1970. So it was a ban that was in place for almost 50 years. And the ban wasn't a ban in law, but it prohibited women from playing on the grounds affiliated to the Football Association in this country. And so women had to play on things like parks. They played actually in the grounds of Borstalls, anywhere that they could find space. So there were pockets of women forming football clubs, but there was no unifying body until Arthur Hobbs and the other people that I've mentioned, Flo Bilton, put together the Women's Football Association based on an annual tournament that they had each year in Deal. And from there, they formed a committee. If you've anybody here done any committee work? Anybody here done any committee work with football teams or clubs or associations? Yeah, so you know what the politics was like. It was very, very complicated. So, nevertheless, they managed to form the Women's Football Association, and it took a little while for them to put together a women's national team because the FA put no money whatsoever into the Women's Football Association. It was purely run by volunteers out of their own money. They got a tiny little bit of amount from the Central Council for Physical Recreation, which is basically what funded Olympic sports in this country before we had the National Lottery, which came along in the 1990s. So in order to be funded by the Central Council for Physical Recreation, all Olympians had to be amateurs. And so what happened with women's football is they had to be amateurs to be funded. And that caused problems because certain of the players were already good enough to go over and play professionally in Italy. There were professional women's leagues from the late 60s and early 70s. So if a player went over to Italy, they instantly got a ban from the WFA a couple of years after the idea of women's football had been banned anyway. So the logic of the WFA committee was often difficult to follow. That first 11 then played in 1972, November 1972, almost exactly 100 years after the first international England men's match took place. So that's how far behind the organisation of women's football has been. And right from 1872, when the England men played their first international match, all of the male players has been given their unique number. And there are what are called the football yearbooks that record the squads and record the debutantes. So if you were researching men's football, you'd have a very clear path to follow to get these player numbers. But nobody had ever done this work before for the women. And there was a lot of the people, because they were amateurs, just kind of wrote the squad down on the back of a cigarette packet, and it was managing to locate the person and their cigarette packet to be able to put this list of players together. Not least because the programmes that were printed, and again, done very cheaply by amateurs who were doing it for the love of women's football, they would often print the programme the week before, but the squad would change in the week, what with injuries, illness, what have you. So if I'd have gone purely on the programmes that were printed, it would have been wrong. So if any of you are ever doing any academic work, and I've spoken to a couple of people here today who do that work, it was about triangulating the evidence. It was looking at what the programme said, trying to find a match report in the newspaper that correlated with the programme, and then other source from wherever, photographs, player recollections, so on and so forth, to try to piece together what had happened. And I will just give an example of how difficult that is. There was a match played against the Netherlands in 1973, England women, and we have four different versions of the England lineup. The Dutch FA have one, the WFA had another, and people who were there at the time had written things on the programme, so we have two programmes, and none of the pieces of information exactly match. There are one or two players in that lineup that we're still not 100% sure of. And what tends to happen as things get digitised, particularly, unfortunately, with Wikipedia is not my friend, is that the wrong information gets amplified. So that people, there are quite a few people now, you'll see them if you have a look, who are trying to put together databases of the England women's matches, and because they use Wikipedia, their information is wrong. So that's the kind of challenge of the research that I've been doing. Equally, if you go to player recollections, I don't know, anybody here who was a striker? You a striker? No? If you ask a striker if they scored a goal in 1973, what do you think they're going to say? Yes. and if you take a goal off them and say, actually, I don't think you scored that goal in 1973, they're not very happy about it. So player recollections, again, through no fault of the players or anybody's fault, but it's just the nature of doing oral histories that, it can be a contested history, shall we say that. So another challenge that I faced is the age of the players, particularly those ones from 72. And the number one player is of course, the goalkeeper. And her name in 1972 was Sue Bucket. Now, Sue is 80 years old. No, she was 80 years old when I interviewed her. She's 82 now. And it's quite well known in the public domain, so I'm not giving away anything that's unethical, but Sue is suffering from early onset dementia, and so it was quite challenging to talk about her career with her. But what I did was to speak to Sue with her friend Vanessa Rainbird, who is also a very good footballer in the Southampton region. And a PE teacher, and we used quite a lot of memorabilia to prompt Sue's memories, and I double checked with Vanessa for different factual elements, and it's actually a really interesting process because it also gives you the insight into women's lives at the time. So Sue was actually a very good all-round sportswoman. She wasn't particularly football focused in her interest. She did all kinds of sports and was a very, very good canoeist. She excelled at canoeing. But at the time, I don't think women's canoeing was included in the Olympic Games until the 1960s. And there was absolutely no funding for it. So it was not something that she was ever going to be able to necessarily get to do at an Olympic Games because there just wasn't the infrastructure to sort of develop that particular sport. So she almost kind of got dragged into football by her mates because it's what everybody else was doing. And then because no one wants to play in goal at that level, they kind of stuck Sue in goal because she didn't mind diving around. And there was absolutely no preparation, no coaching, no development whatsoever for female goalkeepers at the time. So she bought England player Bob Wilson's book and taught herself goalkeeping from the book. Which you can imagine how difficult that would be. So she's number one in the list. And the interesting thing about the selection of that first team in 1972 is that it was the first time that the WFA managed to get a little bit of money to have trials for all of the women's clubs that were active at the time. So when they were first formed, there was something like 48 affiliated clubs, and lots of women came along to the trials, from which 48 were selected to go to a training session at Lilleshall, and from that 40-odd, 24 were selected to go to Loughborough University and train ahead of the first match. And Loughborough University was really significant at that time because it was transitioning from being a kind of teacher training college, very much known for PE and art. And one of the lecturers there was a guy called Eric Worthington, and he was the coach for the first match. And he was a coach educator at the FA. So they actually loaned this very technical expert to the WFA to be the first coach in 1972, and he selected the team. Took them up to Ravenscraig Stadium in Scotland. Although the FA had lifted the ban on women playing on their pitches in 1970, they weren't ever so keen on providing a facility for the first international. So they had to go to Scotland. The Scottish FA didn't recognise the squad that had been selected by a woman called Elsie Cook. So they could only get Ravenscraig Stadium because it was a privately owned, basically athletic stadium that happened to have a football pitch. And the England team had to travel by coach, and one of the players from Blackpool remembers, although again none of the teams had got any money whatsoever, that her local team at Blackpool actually fundraised to get a minibus so that they could all go up to watch her play for England. So very few supporters. It was a bitingly cold day. The match probably should not have been played in November 1972. They talk about it being absolutely Baltic. The pitch was as hard as iron, and they say it's a wonder that nobody broke a leg. Nobody broke a leg, it was fine. England won 3-2. Scotland scored first, and then the great Rose Riley for Scotland scored their second direct from a corner, which she used to practice, and you can see that on YouTube. It's not just a striker talking, you know, or intending to score that goal from a corner. Rose actually used to practice. So Scotland went 2-0 up, and then Sylvia Gore scored England's first goal, and England eventually won at 3-2. Sylvia, unfortunately, is one of the players who's no longer with us, but we've only at the moment lost a handful of those 227 women. So it's what was really great, and again, you know, if I was a historian of men's football, it would have had to be 100 years ago for me to go around and interview the first ever England men's team players. And it was such a great opportunity. I feel very honoured that I got to interview these players. Because otherwise we're going to lose their stories. They're not as well known as they should be. So. Yeah, ask me a question.
You said there was a lot of development in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
So when did the internationals begin to develop? I mean, did we learn from Italy and Spain where they'd been longer?
The first internationals go back to the 1920s. Dick Kerr ladies played against France in the 1920s. And they've got a long history of playing against one another. If you look at the player scrapbooks of the likes of Dick Kerr sort of representing England, there are wonderful little photographs of friendships going on between the wars and after the wars. So certainly there were continental women's teams, Belgium, France, Australia, a lot of the 10-pound poms who left the UK go over to Australia and set up women's teams. But really, this is the era that I'm speaking about, 72, is when the internationals really start. And it is something, although FIFA don't recognise that first one in 72 as the first women's international, it was one that was played in 1971 between the Netherlands and France. Certainly there were big developments, and key players like I've spoken about, like Kerry Davis, who some of you may have heard of, the first mixed heritage player to play for England women. Kerry's family are from the Caribbean, and she went over to play professionally in Italy and certainly learned from them because they were playing in international sides like any professional side. So Kerry was in the side with people, the best women from Sweden, from Scotland, from America, and they all were learning together. Okay, let me jump forward then. Let me say something about Eric Worthington. Eric Worthington only managed England for one game because he then was offered a position with the Australian Football Confederation to go over to Australia and develop their coach education system. So in an odd way, I was fortunate enough to go out to Australia for Women's World Cup last year. Eric has passed, but his wife is still alive. And he's much better known in Australia than he is in England for what he did for the England women's team. Most of the coaches that England have had, until Hope Powell was appointed in 1998, most of them were amateurs, as were the players. So just to highlight, I'll start to sort of draw it to some sort of conclusion, and then you can ask me questions about any aspect of the history. The sort of highlights are that 1984, England make the final of the first ever Women's Euros, although it wasn't called that by UEFA, but effectively that's what it was. And we played against Sweden. It was a two-legged final, which shows how experimental women's football was. They were literally making it up as they went along. But the first part of the final was played in Sweden, which the Swedish won. And then the second part of the final was played in England, which England won. So then there was a penalty shootout, and we lost. And it's known as the Battle of Kenilworth Bog, because the pitch was so bad. It should not have been played. The FA would not provide the pitch. The England team was still being organised by the WFA in 1984. The FA didn't want to put any money into it, and so the only ground that they could get was, Kenilworth ground. So, yeah, that's and the players remember that to this day. The great Pia Sundhage for Sweden, who was a fantastic striker, scored the winning penalty, and Pia Sundhage has consequently gone on to become coach of Sweden. She's coached the USA, she's coached Brazil women, and she's gone on to a really important coaching career. And the development of those players, talking about relative to different countries, the fact that the Swedish players were kept within the organisation and developed by the Swedish FA into coaches is very different than what happened here. When Hope Powell was appointed in 1998, there were only 5 women with their A licences, which is the top coaching qualification at that time in this country. There were 5 women. Hope Powell did not have that qualification, so she was offered the appointment. And in so doing, she became the youngest ever England manager, the first black England manager, and the first openly gay England manager, all in her mid-30s. So that was a lot for her to sort of take on to transition. And she coached England until the Women's Euros in 2013. So she was there for 15 years. And that's what I talk about in terms of the revolution of Sarina Wiegman. So given what I've just described to you, when Sarina Wiegman was appointed in 2020, she was the first ever coach for an England women's national team who had proven international experience, because Sarina had taken the Netherlands to win Women's Euros in 2017, and she then took the Netherlands to the final of the Women's World Cup in 2019, a feat which she's replicated with England women. So winning the Women's Euros in 2022 and then going to the final of the Women's World Cup in 2023. So that's how recent the change in attitude has been at the FA. And Sarina, of course, is of that generation where she understands how amateur the nature of women's football has been, because she had to be a PE teacher for her career, basically to subsidise her coaching career. And it was only relatively late in life, in her 50s, after she'd had her 2 daughters, that she got the opportunity to coach at the highest particular level. So when she went to the FA at St George's Park, if you ever get to go to St George's, there's the Hilton Hotel. Anybody ever been? Yeah. There's the Hilton Hotel, and then there are the FA buildings. There is a pitch nearest to the FA buildings that used to be known as the men's pitch. And Sarina said, why is it's a pitch? Why is it the men's pitch? Oh, well, the England men always train on there. And she said, well, now we're going to train on there. So that's how quick the revolution has kind of changed in terms of the leadership that she's brought to England women. Obviously, there's been a massive change. I don't think Hope Powell is recognised as the pioneer that she is, not just for what she did for women of colour and in terms of representation and diversity, but she knew that a lot of England women, to make their careers, were going over to the USA for college soccer on scholarships. Kelly Smith famously played over in the USA at Seton Hall. And to stop that player migration, Hope Powell said we need our own professional league in England. And so 2010-11, the WSL was formed to try to keep more England players playing in England so that the coach could see them and they could all develop together. And also to draw over the best talent in the world to play in England against the England players to develop them. And in that, the WSL has been largely successful. So, when we were talking earlier, we were talking about Vivian Miedema at Arsenal. When you have a league that is drawing that kind of talent into England, then it's probably one of the 2 most important leagues in the world, along with the National Women's Soccer League in the USA. So, on that note, you very kindly listened to me for quite a while. Do you want to ask me anything? Discuss anything?
Are we going to win the next World Cup?
Difficult, isn't it? Difficult. What did people... I mean...
Well, the progress has been so astronomical that we can't see it going anywhere other than up. Maybe I'm just an optimist.
Yeah, and just on that, as I said,
if you weren't there on the gallery tour, the national associations are definitely interested in what one another is doing now. So there's a thing in the UK called the regional training centres, because obviously how the elite women get spotted is different than in men's football. Whereas in men's football, if a boy is not in an academy by the age of 8 or 9, he's probably not going to make it as a professional footballer. But these regional training centres are where girls go to be developed for the elite. And the heads of the regional training centres have been over on study visits to Spain to see why there is that kind of technical development in Spain for the women as well as the men. So I think it bodes well that there is that level of interest to develop the technical side of it. And actually, given what I've said about the development of female coaches, there's been a significant appointment at the FA with a post dedicated to developing, you know, the next elite workforce technical development. So more players, you'll see players like Izzy Christiansen and those sort of players who you'll see on TV as pundits. They're also taking their coaching badges now and be moving through the ranks. So hopefully we won't need to go abroad for a foreign manager. We'll grow our own.
Did the universities and the military, did they have teams early on?
Yeah, I've spoken to the, people at the Army FA. A lot of women didn't really play in the military until the 1980s because of the reputation, the kind of reputation that, you know, everybody, all the women who play football are gay, and you've got the prohibition on, you know, gay people in the military. A lot of women who I've spoken to said, oh, if I played football, I grew my hair long, so I'd look more feminine. So you do get that, but even Oxford and Cambridge universities have got their women's football team. Yeah.
But they could just play, I suppose, the youth's got their own grounds and just play there, couldn't they? So they wouldn't be able to stop them.
Exactly that. It's access to resources, isn't it? If they've got their own grounds and pitches and, yeah.
What about schools? Now, I mean, do schools give the girls as much support as the boys' teams?
I think they are. I think they are very slowly, but it's quite difficult in schools, isn't it? Because with the national curriculum, and access to pitches, and the school day is already so crowded, it's quite difficult, isn't it? Yeah.
Actually, just off the back of a lady's comment that they did in school, I go into schools in the area to do a qualitative prevention program.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot about, you know, opportunities of equality between boys and girls at school.
Yeah.
So the question I have, well, just to feedback on that point, we find that some schools are supporting some girls to go and play football, but not all of them and not regularly. And sometimes they do it in a slightly watered down version as well, and they don't get to play like the boys do against other schools. So it's not quite at the same level as boys playing football at all. But I just wanted to the question I had was, when the football was banned in the 1920s, what was the reason that was given? From your perspective, what was going on there and why did that happen?
There are 3 comments that the FA made about the ban. One is that the game of football is unsuitable for women, which it clearly wasn't, because they'd already been filling up major stadiums and raising money for charity. 2 is that they implied that the amateur players had, in the FA's words, absorbed too much of the charitable money in their own expenses. They'd misused charitable money, and there is no evidence of that whatsoever. And 3, that it just should not be encouraged. And I gave the example earlier, forgive me for people who have heard this once already, but they did protest the ban. So a famous club called the Ladies got 44 doctors to witness a game, and in the press the doctor said it was no more arduous than a heavy day's washing. Because obviously washing then, we didn't have white goods, it was all done by hand.
So it was for the benefit of the women that they didn't do it?
Yes, the women needed protecting from themselves, which you get an awful lot of that in sport. So in the 1928 Olympics, it was the first time a women's 800-metre race had been run. And a couple of the women sort of fell a little bit over the line. You know, they'd really pushed themselves and sort of fell a little bit over the line. And the International Athletics Federation then banned distances over 200 yards for women in the Olympics until the 1960s. Because they were running faster than was good for them. Yeah, because one Italian businessman had moved into women's football in the late 60s. So if you think about it, if you ban something, it was like a lot of gambling in this country. If you ban something and say we're just not having that, you create an unregulated market. And people go, oh, you're not interested in that market, then we'll do something about it over here. And Italian businessmen were making money out of women's football in Italy in professional leagues. All of those Italian clubs had sponsors. And the Italian businessmen started to club together and go, okay, let's hold a European Championship in 68, 69. And then they host the first unofficial Women's World Cup in 1970, make quite a lot of money. It gets franchised out to Mexico in 1971, make even more money. So there's a documentary about the unofficial 71 Women's World Cup called Copper 71. It's on the BBC, I think it's on the iPlayer. It's on the iPlayer. Yeah, I would encourage you. It'll infuriate you, and it will make you laugh.
The ladies in the 60s and 70s who went abroad and learned from leagues abroad, when they came back to England after they finished their careers, did the footballing structure make any use of their experiences, or were they ignored?
They were ignored, I'm afraid. I mean, if you talk to Kerry Davis about this, that's one of the things that I think she is regretful of, that more use was not made of her expertise. So she was a striker. I think Kerry, I better be careful here because she doesn't like it if I get it wrong. So the leading goal scorer, I think she's the third behind Kelly Smith at the moment, Kerry Davis. So she was a very, very good world-class striker. And she was actually traded for some of the biggest names in that league, like Carolina Marachi. She played alongside Rose Riley. But more or less she was obliged to come back to England, which she didn't necessarily want to do if she was going to continue to play for England. And then I think she would have liked to go on to a coaching career, but was never really invited to do so. And I give the example of in the book, it wasn't done, and I'd gone to some England training camps in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the grown women were infantilised. I mean, there were 9 o'clock curfews, and people were sent home for wearing the wrong tracksuit bottoms, and just the general atmosphere at England training camps. It didn't pay to have an opinion. So when England captain Deb Bampton, who herself is a very good coach and has coached at a number of women's clubs, she offered the opinion to the England manager Ted Copeland of how much the USA were developing, just in terms of strength and conditioning and fitness, compared with England women. And that opinion was not welcomed. And I think she, on 96 caps, she never played for England again. So the women had to be really careful what they did and didn't say.
I think there was a real breakthrough last year when Forest Green Rovers appointed a female head coach as head coach of the men's team. As far as I know, that was the first time the female head coach had been appointed to the role of head coach of a men's team in the professional leagues in this country. But sadly, it didn't last very long, did it? It was only a matter of a couple of months. Do you think that's the opening of the floodgates? Do you think that could really start a trend and a development of female head coaches in the men's game?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're seeing more and more of that in American football. Yeah. And I think the in American football, if I can put it like that, is that there are so many different positions available within the squad that you're starting to get some female head coaches, particularly of the kicking positions, you know, rather than the defensive positions, say, or those sorts of things. And I don't see why not. I mean, my comparison is, if Angela Merkel can run a G8 country, then surely a woman can manage a football team. Yeah. You know, it's yeah.
Now, just have you interviewed any of the current lionesses?
Yes, we did a session. I took a risk, and I can talk about this because it's in Beth Mead's book. I took a risk. So when I was asked originally to do this work, it was when Phil Neville was the manager and Gareth Southgate. Around the FA knowing their own history, obviously a lot of the young men who play for England are very young, and they wouldn't necessarily know who Bobby Moore was, say, compared with not many people within the FA know the women's history. So I've done a couple of sessions like that, and Sarina Wiegman came along to one of the sessions that we did. And I took a bit of a risk in respect of, I had Kerry Davis as the first person of mixed heritage to play for her country, and one of the first to be named in a programme as a professional footballer. Carol Thomas, the first woman to 50 caps for England, and she almost got 50 caps as captain. And then I took 3 of the unofficial players from that World Cup in 1971, who, if you watch Copper 71, you'll see them. Chris, Leah and Jill. They were the youngest in 1971. They were only 14, 15, 16, and their mum and dads allowed them to go to Mexico. They had a great time. We presented to Sarina in the technical department, and then ahead of the Arnold Clark Cup, before we won the Euros, we presented to the England squad. And had dinner with them and stuff like that. So that was really interesting. That's what I was saying. Mary Earps is super, super switched on. Lucy Bronze knew quite a lot of I think her mum's, you know, quite right on, and she knew quite a lot of the history. Yeah.
I think I've heard them talk about the value of that before some of the matches, about understanding their heritage and appreciating their trailblazers, and hopefully that will embed in them the importance of not just being footballers, but and they have been very sort of not outspoken, but they've made it clear that they want to leave a legacy, and like them having football pitches named after them after the Euros, haven't they? Open different pitches at different parts of the country, like Jill Scott and stuff, so that they are, you know, although we're talking about history, they're creating new history of that it's going to be even better.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, in a way, we call it the unpaid work of women's football as academics, because we're asking them not just to play football, but to be social pioneers as well at the same time, which must be exhausting, even if you're as fit as Leah Williams and, you know, at 24 you're trying to do all this on your young shoulders. But I think you're starting to see certain men within the men's game take that on as well. Marcus Rashford, school meals, that kind of thing, so that they understand that the football gives them a platform for other things. And it's brilliant as well that England gives them that platform, because it's not their club football that's doing that for them. So they're very, very savvy in negotiating, I think, what they want from their football career. Nobody more so than Jill Scott, and again, what a fantastic role model she is. And she's always been like that, you know, she is just funny. And I think it came across in the I'm a Celebrity stuff. And again, out in Australia, I was working with the Football Supporters Association out there, and we were doing fan meetups. And at each fan meetup, we'd have a celebrity come along to make it kind of exciting for the fans. And, you know, we'd have Wrighty came along to one, and Jill Scott came along to one. And they're just very, very gracious with people. Nobody goes away without a photograph or something signed or whatever. And kind of understanding to grow the game. But having FA bashed quite a lot in this talk, what I will say is that was a first for me in the Women's Euros, because they actually had a heritage programme, which we got lottery funding for. So in all 10 host cities, we did player interviews, we got memorabilia out of players' lots. It's now going into the museums. I was doing work with Nationwide Building Society and putting up plaques to Jill Coulthard, the first woman to 100 caps, so that it just becomes more visually, almost kind of casual to see women's football, because we know about men's football even if we don't want to. You can't drive into Wolverhampton and not know about Molineux. So that kind of casual visual thing is a sort of reinforcement of the male entitlement, whereas what we want to do is very subtly change that, and almost as people walk by, they get to know. Not just in football, but great sportswomen.
And just thinking about what you just been saying there, you know, with some of the comments I've heard with regards to some of the people that have been talking about that program, you know, some of them have said that, like an uncle or a dad would say, oh, they don't want to watch women's football, but they watch it secretly.
Yeah.
And then they get and kind of hide the fact that they're watching it.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, and as I say, if you make it more visual, you kind of normalise it, then there isn't that issue.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think there are challenges within the representation of that England team. I think previously, when Hope Powell was, for instance, when Hope Powell was coach, you had Brenda Sempare, who, honestly, such a fantastic, elegant midfielder, Brenda. You had Kerry Davis, and you had Sammy Britton, and they were known as the 4 Degrees. So they were quite famous within women's football circles. There's been a relative lack of diversity recently, largely because where the RTCs are positioned, you've got to have access to private transport to get there. You've got to have a willing parent or adult to take you there, and you've got to have a little bit of time and all the rest of it. So I think they're trying to address some of the diversity issues. But conversely, the common thing that's said is that the England women's team is not as diverse as the men. Well, it is, in some respects, because you've got a greater number of LGBTQ plus individuals who are doing that kind of work as well, whereas in the men's team, there's supposedly none of that. So, you know, I think we've just got to be a little bit nuanced in the way that we produce some of these arguments. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, you mentioned earlier that the women have to be amateurs to be able to receive funding, like the small amount of funding. And I think I read, I think it might have been one of your book that I read, that when they went to Italy there was sponsorship because they were amateurs. And I was just wondering, when did women kind of start to shrug that misconception that they're amateurs, so they weren't going to earn any actual money or they weren't going to be as skillful as the men were? Is there a point that you can say that they kind of get rid of that misassociation?
No, there's no one point in time. It's so individualised now. So just to give you an example, I was doing a little bit of work down at Leicester City recently and talking to people down there. And although ostensibly, if you're in the WSL, it is professional, you know, their psychologist is part-time. And they're just going to appoint a player welfare officer. And it's in the process of professionalising, and they're down at the old men's training facility, whereas the men have had a £2 million facility built up. So it is still professionalising. The likes of Mary Earps and Lucy Bronze and those kind of very, very few players who I would say are fully professional and probably, you know, going to be very well off for life, are still the exception rather than the rule. And I think the interesting thing about that, given the what shall we call it, the gift of the Men's World Cup to Saudi Arabia, I don't know if that's on your horizon, but in the same way that Qatar did, Saudi Arabia has now launched its own women's professional league. And quite a few players are going to that, including a young English woman of also Nigerian heritage who used to play for Leicester City. She's currently out in Saudi Arabia. So, just like in men's football, there's not one form of professionalisation. The Premiership is not like the rest of men's professional football. There's all sorts of different professionalisations within women's football. And how long lived the Saudi Arabian League will be once they've had the Men's World Cup will be interesting to see.
Was the original ban, was there anything in it about when, like at the start of the Second World War, where they wanted the jobs back for the men who combined then? Was there any like political people trying to support against that politically? Then I'm not sure if there's any female MPs there, but sometimes these wealthy women who campaigned about stuff.
Nancy Astor and those kind of first. Well, yeah. Problem with the first women MPs, Nancy Astor, very wealthy, obviously of American heritage, is that they weren't that interested always in women's rights. They were interested in women of their class very often. So there were quite a lot of those people who opposed universal suffrage, which is why when women got the vote initially, it was over 28 and, you know, you had to have so much money or be a householder. But certainly I think the ban was part of a move to try to go back to the way things had been before the First World War. So I'll give the example of Dick Kerr's ladies, who I've mentioned, munitions workers. And already being a munitions worker was a leap forward in terms of your personal circumstances, because the women were earning more money than they'd ever earned before, and they were working outside of someone's home. Before that, they'd been Downton Abbey maids, whatever. So when the munitions jobs were given back to the men, all of the women were thrown out of work, and there was no welfare state. So you had to retrain or you didn't eat. And a lot of the women in Dick Kerr's, for example, became mental health nurses at Whittingham Hospital, looking after the soldiers who had returned from the First World War. And actually that kind of gave them, it was much worse pay, but what they managed to do, because they were working together and playing together, Dick Kerrs carried on playing until 1965, they would swap shifts if there was a match. So, like, can you play, can you play, can you play? Or matron wants me to do this shift, will you cover my shift? And I'll cover for you against this man. So, there's a lot about female camaraderie in the face of sort of society telling them to get back to where they'd been. And you get even more interesting things with other sports like hockey, because obviously after World War I there was a shortage of men. 1 million young men had died during World War I, most of whom were sort of 19, 20. So there was a lot of women who were not going to marry. So the sport set up schemes whereby you could go over to Australia or over to New Zealand or over to wherever and try and find a partner.
Do you think there's anything different in women's football that the men's game could learn from?
I think a younger generation is learning about the kind of social responsibility of it. I don't want to go too far down that route to kind of sentimentalise it. There's no evidence that women's football is any more good-natured or well-behaved or anything than men's football. So I just, put that myth to bed. But one of the things that always makes me wonder, given where we are now with football, is what if we could go back to World War I and football was not organised for profit, but the funds went into charities, say health charities, and became a sort of wider force for social good. I think that would be quite an interesting experiment.
There's something about going being less commercial that makes it more better or more sport-focused?
I don't think so, because I think if you don't like the Premiership, you go and watch non-league football, don't you? You've got a menu of which the Premiership is one thing, and if you don't like it, you go and pick something else. So I don't want to sentimentalise women's football, given the battles that the women have had with absolutely nothing, and say non-commercialised football is better, because why shouldn't Mary Earps go and get a deal with Burberry if that's where her talent is sort of taking her? I do worry with Women's World Cup in 2023. FIFA announced a deal with Visit Saudi, and that country does not have a lot of the values that women's football values more broadly. So I am a bit worried about the Saudi League and what that might imply for the future of women's football. I don't know what anybody else thinks.
When I get to Forest,
when you see the future, you talked a lot about history and where we are now.
Uh-huh.
How do you see it sort of developing in the next sort of 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? Yeah, because if I look, I'm of a certain age, if I look at where we've come from when I was a kid,
yeah,
when girls you just get, you just wasn't, you didn't play football, it was considered unfeminine and everything. Even you didn't have football commentators like now at the moment, or women linesmen or women referees or anything.
Yeah.
So, to me, the point that we're at is quite extraordinary in many ways, and I think you see that in a lot. I was watching the rugby sevens in the Olympics. The women can be that physical. I think it's a really sort of positive development. So, where do you see it going? Will it be the same? Will women be the same as the Premiership, or is that just around the corner, or should it go in a different direction?
I hope we're not going in the direction of the Premiership. Let me give some. I would like to end optimistically. So, some of the things that I'm really encouraged about at the moment, with your rugby example, you'll see that Michelle Kang has just put, I think it's $7 million into the US women's rugby team to help them develop as a sport. And I give the example not really of the WSL, because the WSL is at something of a crossroads. Created by the FA, they've just created this new company where all the clubs are going to be co-owners of that league, and it's going to be it's going to draw funding from the Premiership, which slightly concerns me. But I'll just give you a different model, and that's the one that I'm optimistic about, is Angel City FC in the National Women's Soccer League in the US is part owned by Natalie Portman, Sarina Williams, her husband, a number of the US women who won the 99 Women's World Cup. So it's female owned, it's entrepreneur and entertainment led, it's branded as feminist.
Yeah.
Angel City FC lose most of their games, so they're not by any means the best football side, but because they do so much with their local community, the stands are always full and fans stay after the match. So they've created a real sense of community, and it's not always looking to the men's football model. So I think there are really promising examples. I think that's us, isn't it? I'm happy to hang around and chat, but you've been very patient. Thank you ever so much. And if you want to ask questions or have a chat afterwards, then happy to do that. But thank you. Thank you very much.